Hello and welcome. The title for this dissertation is Sexual Minority Stress, Structural Stigma, and Intersectional Identities, an Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis. I thank the committee for their time and help with this process. To begin, the purpose of this study was to qualitatively examine whether exposure to structural stigma engendered minority stress and was made worse when sexual minorities identified with multiple minority social identities. Social contexts characterized as structurally stigmatic towards sexual minorities engender minority stress. Minority stress is associated with a reduction in physical and mental health problems for sexual minorities compared to their heterosexual counterparts. Furthermore, multiplicative intersectional minority identities compound minority stress, and unique blends of minority identity statuses generate divergent experiences of structural stigma and minority stress. Minority stress was found to be significantly correlated with biological outcomes in 42% of cases after a thorough meta-analysis. Research is showing that Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people are significantly impacted by minority stress associated with structural level marginalization processes that are compounded by intersectional identities of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, which is why they were selected as this population to study. Minority stress is operationalized as excess stress that is beyond general stress and not experienced by heterosexuals, imposed upon sexual minorities because of their stigmatized status. There are two types of minority stress, including distal stress and proximal stress. Distal stress originates in the social context. Prejudice events, such as experiencing structural stigma, is an example of distal stress. Proximal stress originates from psychological stress as a result of exposure to a stigmatic social context. Psychological processes associated with proximal stress include expectations of rejection, prejudice and discrimination, hiding and concealing sexual orientation, and internalizing societal stigma. Specifically, structural stigma, including laws, policies, and social attitudes that stigmatize populations, creates health disparities between groups and is a barrier to the health and status of sexual minorities because it reduces socioeconomic and health life chances for sexual minorities and imposes minority stress. Minority stress resulting from exposure to structural stigma and compounded by intersectional social identities continues to be a negative determinant of physical health, mental health, socioeconomic status, well-being, and life satisfaction. The consequences of exposure to structural stigma and the social imposition of minority stress are associated with higher rates of substance abuse, anxiety, depression, and suicidality for sexual minorities compared to heterosexuals. Minority stress is made worse when sexual minorities have multiple marginalized intersectional identities, because intersectional identities further compound the negative effects of structural stigma upon mental health. Limited studies have quantitatively examined structural stigma, such as laws, policies, and social attitudes. Only a few studies have qualitatively examined structural stigma. To contribute to structural stigma research regarding the effect structural stigma has upon mental health, there was a need to qualitatively examine experiences of structural stigma, coping mechanisms such as concealment, and other resiliency factors using an intersectional framework that accounts for variables such as sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and gender. Problem and purpose statements. The problem to be addressed by this study is the minority stress Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people experience engendered by exposure to structural stigma and compounded by intersectional minority identities of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender. Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people experience minority stress engendered by structural stigma through lived experiences and expectations of prejudice, discrimination, victimization, marginalization, concealment of sexual orientation, and internalized stigma, to name a few. The purpose of this qualitative interpretive phenomenological analysis is to interpret the lived experiences of minority stress Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people experience that is engendered by exposure to structural stigma and compounded by intersectional stigmatized social identities. Research questions. Research question 1 was, what are Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of sexual minority stress as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status? Research question 1A was, what are Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of prejudice events, expectations of rejection, hiding and concealing, and internalized homophobia as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status? Research question 2 was, what are Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of how to reduce sexual minority stress as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status? Research question 2A was, what are Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of ameliorative coping processes as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status? For theoretical framework, Meyer 2003 found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual populations experience higher rates of psychological disorders when compared to heterosexuals. To account for the higher rates of psychological disorders, Meyer proposed the minority stress model as a conceptual framework that can be applied to explain the specific type of social stress sexual minorities experience that engenders higher rates of psychological disorders when compared to heterosexuals. The minority stress model is an objective approach to studying minority stress that focuses upon the social impacts of stigma and discrimination upon health. Meyer's model includes the distal-proximal distinction as the axes from which to study minority stress for sexual minorities. Meyer identified 4 major components of minority stress experienced by sexual minorities that exist along a continuum ranging between distal and proximal stress. These include experiencing prejudice events, expectations of rejection, hiding and concealing, internalized homophobia, and ameliorative coping processes. All minority stress processes contained in the minority stress model have been supported by research. For example, Flente et al. Found that distal and minority stress processes included in the minority stress model were significantly associated with minority stress. Review of the literature. Even though social change led to the social construction of a less intolerant society towards sexual minorities in the U.S., minority stress continues to adversely affect the health of sexual minorities. Furthermore, Hatzenbuehler 2017 stated that despite social change in laws, policies, and attitudes which reduce structural stigma, sexual minority groups continue to experience adverse health effects due to the exposure to structural stigma. For example, Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018 found a significant relationship between structural stigma and psychological health disparities between heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals. Flente et al. Found that all components of Meyer's minority stress model and Hatzenbuehler and Link's theory of structural stigma were associated with physical health. Additionally, according to Choi et al., the blending of intersectionality in the minority stress model is a recent trend, resulting from the awareness that multiple stigmatized identities engender divergent levels of oppression and stigma. For example, Thoma et al. Stated that intersectional sexual orientation, racial, ethnic, and gender identities compound the experience of minority stress for sexual minorities because identifying with more than one minority group increases the number of experienced prejudice events, creates barriers to support and belongingness, makes hiding and concealing more difficult, lowers internalized homonegativity, and increases expectations of rejection. Research methodology and design. By qualitatively investigating the influence of the social context upon cognition and behavior, along with individual cognition, psychologists can understand how structural stigma affects sexual minorities from the participants' perspective, along with their shared experiences. The research questions were designed to elicit subjective lived experiences of minority stress, engendered by structural stigma and compounded by intersectional identities. To address the research questions, interpretive phenomenological analysis was utilized to examine the experiential essences shared by individuals and the meanings attached to their experiences of structural stigma. The primary data collection strategy for this study was semi-structured interviews. Smith et al. 2022 refer to the in-depth interviews as a purposeful, facilitated conversation event that enables data gathering regarding participants' experiences from their perspective to inform about relevant topics related to the research questions. Population and sample. The population for this study was Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people in the United States. Interpretive phenomenological analysis studies generally utilize a small homogeneous sample size consisting of 5 to 10 expert group participants that the research will be meaningful to. Doctoral dissertations generally use 8 to 10. After approval from the IRB, a homogeneous sample of 9 participants was recruited. To recruit participants, the study used purposive homogeneous sampling. Advertising social media posts on social media websites was utilized to solicit participants. An interview guide consisting of a script and an interview protocol was developed with consideration for the process outlined by Smith et al. To structure the data collection process. The researcher followed the interview guide to ensure continuity regarding the integrity of the design and the protection of the data being sought to also increase trustworthiness. The interview protocol was validated by field testing using 3 experts to gain consensual convergence. Study procedures. The primary data collection strategy for this study was semi-structured interviews. Once IRB permission had been approved and the participants were deemed eligible, agreed to participate in the study, and signed the informed consent forms, the interviews took place. Each participant was individually interviewed via Zoom. The initial interviews ranged between 45 and 90 minutes, and the member checking session was completed via email. At the beginning of the interview, the purpose of the study was reiterated: documentation for informed consent, permission to record, and a thorough explanation of confidentiality was provided. The interview began by reading the interview guide, consisting of a script and the interview protocol. Questions contained in the interview protocol were asked one at a time to allow the participant enough time to thoroughly answer and reflection after each answer. Throughout the reflective interview, quoted notes were taken to highlight language, keywords, topics, and to begin developing exploratory codes. The interview ended by asking clarification questions, reiterating the purpose of the study, informed consent, and confidentiality, and allowing the participant to ask any questions. The participants participated in a member checking session 1 week after the initial interview by reviewing the transcript and providing feedback. The participants were thanked for their participation and provided with the contact information for the researcher, the dissertation chair, and the IRB of National University in case they have concerns or comments. Data analysis. The 7 steps of interpretive phenomenological analysis included: 1. Reading the transcript, which was done by the researcher. 2. Creating exploratory notes. 3. Developing experiential statements. 4. Clustering the experiential statements into personal experiential themes and sub-themes for individual participants. 5. Organizing the experiential statements into a table. 6. Completing steps 1 through 5 for each participant. And 7. Creating group experiential themes and sub-themes. The writing up process entailed presenting an account of participants' experiences of the phenomena, to include experiential statements, personal experiential themes, and direct quotes as evidence to support interpretations to make the case for what it is like to be the participant experiencing the phenomenon. Limitations. A potential limitation in the study was that the interview protocol was strictly adhered to as a mechanism by which to support trustworthiness, such as dependability for each interview. The study's inability to delve off script may have reduced the ability to explore participants' lived experiences more fully. Additionally, a potential limitation in the study was that the interviews were conducted via Zoom. This resulted in a few interruptions of the interviews while service issues were corrected. Service errors did significantly interrupt the interviews. Moreover, a potential limitation of the study is that multiple sources of data, such as demographic information, were not obtained by the researcher. Also, it was assumed that the participants were honest regarding their meeting the criteria for participation in the study. Furthermore, due to lack of demographic data, it is difficult to ascertain whether variables such as region or socioeconomic status produce divergent experiences. Ethical assurances. This study adhered to all ethical standards required by National University's IRB. Informed consent to participate in the study was obtained verbally prior to data collection. This study involved the risk of harm because the topic matter is sensitive. Therefore, in accordance with Standard 3.04 of the APA Ethics Code, the researchers avoided harm. This researcher was prepared with support options in case the need arose for mental referrals. Findings. Research question 1. Research question 1 was constructed to explore Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of sexual minority stress as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status. The analysis revealed 3 group experiential themes for this section, of which all 9 participants contributed. The first experiential theme was negative social attitudes directly impact individuals. The second was minority stress has adverse impacts on psychological well-being. And the third was multiple minority social identities intensify experiences of minority stress. Group experiential theme 1.1. Negative social attitudes directly impact individuals. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of how negative social attitudes directly impacted them. Participants identified negative social attitudes as the significant source of structural stigma that caused them minority stress. For example, RK said of trying to be oneself. So it's like the whole community, the system, the law itself is built around a particular idea, and no one is expected to drift apart from it. You just have to stick with it and go with it. Group experiential theme 1.2, adverse impacts on psychological well-being. This specific theme addresses the effect minority stress engendered by structural stigma had upon participants' psychological well-being. Specifically, exposure to structural stigma elevated stress levels. For example, Gray said, "It's been quite strenuous. It makes it a lot harder to go about your day-to-day activities like every other normal person. Activities which are supposed to be stress-free, normal day-to-day activities." Group experiential theme 1.3, multiply minority social identities intensify experiences of minority stress. This theme focused upon how identifying with multiple minorities made navigating the social world more complex, increased the amount of structural stigma they encountered, and increased minority stress. For example, JC shared about having multiple identities. My ethnicity or my race has its own advantage already. Having multiple identities has sort of given me more reasons when to hide my sexuality. It has made me more insecure. It's bad enough people are not acknowledging as they should. Then they hate your personality, which I believe your sexuality is. When it comes to being Latinx or black, people have these concepts or ideas in their head, and then you are declaring yourself gay or something, or gender nonconforming. I have realized in a way it's sort of almost validates what they think. They sort of see it like a confirmation of what they already think of you. Findings. Research question 1A. The analysis revealed 4 group experiential themes for this section, of which all 9 participants contributed. The first experiential theme identified was experiencing persistent prejudice in daily life. The second was navigating layers of rejection. The third was recurrently hiding and concealing, and the fourth was internalizing homophobic attitudes. Group experiential theme 1A1, experiencing persistent prejudice in daily life. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of the specific components of minority stress. Participants reported experiencing prejudice as a result of exposure to structural stigma, and their membership in multiple minority groups made their experiences more complex. For example, JC said, "There is a huge pushback against being gay." Group experiential theme 1A2, navigating layers of rejection. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of social rejection and exclusion. For example, JC said regarding intersectional rejection, "I would say, based upon my sexual identity, based upon my race, there has been a lot of rejections, yeah." Group experiential theme 1.3, 1A3, recurrently hiding and concealing. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of having to hide and conceal for reasons such as the inability to conceal all identities, the difficulties associated with pretending, and lack of acceptance catalyzing the need to conceal in various contexts. For example, Tyler stated regarding prejudice at work, "I would rather not make it known, if not something that I am asked. I wouldn't make it known because most people don't understand. 2 years ago, I hadn't told a lot. Most people didn't know my sexual identity then, so that was particular to work. While I was applying for the job, I noticed the boss was homophobic. He didn't want any person that identified as gay or lesbian to work with him. So I had to hide my identity for some time until I was really tired of him because he was one of the worst homophobic persons I've ever met in my life. It was very, very, very difficult for me when I was working with that man because he made sure he brought it up every day. It was like he would watch the news and just keep blabbing, saying homophobic shit, and it was horrible for me. So yeah, I had to conceal my identity because I just wanted to work and make some money. Group Experiential Theme 1A4, Internalizing Homophobic Attitudes. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of internalizing homophobic attitudes. Participants reported internalizing negative social attitudes which affected how they felt about themselves to the extent that they doubted oneself, experienced the need to conform, and struggled to be oneself. For example, our case said about the pressure to conform. For one, it creates a sort of internal conflict, making it quite hard to pursue who you really are. Now all of these negative experiences makes it harder to make that journey to begin with. So you're sort of at a point where you don't know whether you should continue down that lane or you should try to change and try to fit in with every other person and try to see if it's better that way. So it hinders how fast it takes to transition from hiding your identity to coming out or even discovering yourself. Findings, RQ2. Research question 2 was constructed to explore Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of how to reduce sexual minority stress as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status. The analysis revealed one group experiential theme for this section, of which all 9 participants contributed. The group experiential theme identified was reducing negative social attitudes reduces minority stress. Group Experiential Theme 2.1, Reducing Negative Social Attitudes Reduces Minority Stress. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of how to reduce negative social attitudes, reduces minority stress, and increases the frequency of enacting anti-bias laws, policies, and services. Kay said about social inclusion, making everyone feel included. There is this sort of treatment for the normal sexual identities, and there's this whole other special treatment for the LGBTQT community. Now there is still a way of dividing between both sides. I feel things should be equal. There should be something, which is equality. No one should be pushed away. No one should be set apart. We should all be included. No one should be treated special and separate from others. That way it would be easier to blend in. Findings, RQ2A. Research question 2A was constructed to explore Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's lived experiences of how to cope with sexual minority stress as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with race, ethnicity, and gender status. The analysis revealed 2 group experiential themes for this section, of which all 9 participants contributed. The first group experiential theme identified was taking care of oneself. The second was interacting with community. Group experiential theme 2A1, taking care of oneself. This specific theme refers to participants' lived experiences of taking care of oneself mentally and physically to cope with sexual minority stress. For example, Craig said of accepting oneself. Well, the first safety is yourself. It has to be you. That has to be you. Be safe to yourself. It has to be you. Being less abusive to yourself. It has to be you. Believing in yourself first before you think of a place where you can find safety. The better way to the better way to cope is to find strength in yourself first. Group Experiential Theme 2A2, Interacting with Community. This specific theme refers to the benefits of interacting with those that share a common culture and forming relationships. For example, Kay said of belonging to a community. I belong to an LGBTQ community, and I am with the other people that share the same ideas, and we are a community. It has been my go-to source for someone to talk to or someone to speak with. Implications and evaluations for research question 1. Research question 1 addressed whether structural stigma caused minority stress. Group Experiential Theme 1.1 highlights how distal stress in the form of structural stigma, specifically negative social attitudes, engenders minority stress for sexual minorities, which confirm Meyer et al.'s 2015 finding that although intolerance towards sexual minorities has reduced over the last several decades, sexual minorities continue to experience minority stress engendered by exposure to distal stress. Furthermore, Group Experiential Theme 1.1 highlights the association between structural stigma and minority stress, which adds to structural stigma and minority stress research. and that structural stigma in the form of negative social attitudes was found to cause minority stress. Group Experiential Theme 1.1 Negative Social Attitudes Directly Impact Individuals contributes to knowledge regarding minority stress theory, and that it highlighted how distal minority stress in the form of structural stigma caused proximal minority stress and psychological distress for sexual minorities, which confirmed the finding of Meyer 2003 that experiencing distal stress and proximal stress causes psychological distress. Group Experiential Theme 1.1 was not a surprise. The study by Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018 revealed that sexual minorities being exposed to forms of structural stigma, such as negative social attitudes, is associated with an increase in psychological distress and accounts for psychological health disparities between heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals. According to minority stress theory, Group Experiential Theme 1.1, experiencing negative social attitudes directly impact individuals, can be understood by considering the role distal stress plays in causing proximal stress. Experiencing structural stigma such as negative social attitudes causes proximal stress for sexual minorities, such as social rejection, having to conceal, and internalized homophobia, all of which affect psychological well-being. Group Experiential Theme 1.2 confirmed the finding of Brandstrom and Pachonkas 2020 and Hatzenbuehler 2017, who found that structural stigma caused psychological distress, and that it highlights how structural stigma adversely affects the psychological well-being of sexual minorities. Group Experiential Theme 1.2 contributes to the research on minority stress theory, and that it reveals how a specific type of distal stressor, structural stigma, imposed minority stress and caused psychological distress in a population of Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people. Group Experiential Theme 1.2 was not a surprise. Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018 noted that the adverse effect of structural stigma upon the psychological health of sexual minorities is well documented. According to minority stress theory, Group Experiential Theme 1.2 can be understood by considering how exposure to stigma is associated with distal and proximal stressors that cause psychological stress. Minority stress processes are associated with adverse health in the form of depression, substance abuse, and suicidality, for example. Group Experiential Theme 1.3 contributes to research on minority stress and structural stigma because the finding that belonging to multiple stigmatized groups exposed sexual minorities to multiple forms of structural stigma that compounded and complexified their experiences with sexual minority stress confirmed the findings of Walubita et al. 2022, who found that Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people are more at risk for experiencing minority stress than single stigma persons due to exposure to multiple forms of prejudice events. Furthermore, the findings of Group Experiential Theme 1.3 that experiencing multiple forms of stigma not only increases minority stress, but that multiple forms of stigma that compounded the adverse effects of stigma upon psychological stress. Group Experiential Theme 1.3 contributes knowledge to the minority stress model regarding the association between structural stigma, minority stress, and intersectional identities, because it highlights how experiencing multiple forms of structural stigma, such as heterosexism, racism, ethnocentrism, and cisgenderism, increase the level of complexity of sexual minority stress sexual minorities experience, which confirmed the findings of Earnshaw et al. 2022, who found that sexual minorities who are also racial ethnic minorities experience more structural stigma than white sexual minorities. Group Experiential Theme 1.3 was not a surprise. For instance, Walubita revealed that sexual minorities with multiplicative minority identities experience more minority stress than other groups. According to minority stress theory, Group Experiential Theme 1.3 can be understood by considering the role multiple sources of social stress related to social structures and environmental conditions, such as low socioeconomic status, homophobia, racism, ethnocentrism, and sexism impact the amount of stress sexual minorities experience and how each unique combination of identities creates varying experiences of stigma between individuals and how they interact within the social context. Implications and evaluations, RQ1A. Group Experiential Theme 1A1 contributes to minority stress research by highlighting how sexual minorities experience distal stress in the form of structural stigma that catalyze proximal stress processes and had a negative impact upon their psychological health. This finding confirmed the findings of Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018, who found that structural stigma causes psychological distress. Group Experiential Theme 1A1 confirmed the relevancy of prejudice events as a pillar of the minority stress model, and Myers' finding that distal stress caused proximal stress and adversely affected the psychological health in sexual minorities, and that this finding highlights how Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people experience prejudice defense in the form of structural stigma that cause adverse psychological effects. Group Experiential Theme 1A1 was not a surprise. Meyer noted that prejudice events are core stressors experienced by sexual minorities. According to minority stress theory, group experiential theme 1A1 can be understood by considering how prejudice events such as anti-gay violence and discrimination are core stressors that affect sexual minorities. Meyer described how anti-gay prejudice and discrimination and violence have existed throughout history and continue to negatively affect the physical and psychological health of sexual minorities. Group Experiential Theme 1A2 contributes to minority stress research in that it highlights how experiences and expectations of rejection cause psychological distress for Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming purposes. For example, Serrazzo et al. 2020 found that sexual, racial, ethnic, and gender minorities experience familial and social rejection. The finding of Group Experiential Theme 1A2, navigating layers of rejection, contributes to minority stress theory, and that it confirmed expectations of rejection as a relevant pillar of the minority stress model. Group Experiential Theme 1A2 highlights how sexual minorities expect to be rejected by family, friends, and society due to their sexual orientation, which confirmed Myers' 2003 finding that sexual minorities learn to expect rejection because stigmatized people may expect negative regard when interacting with the dominant cultural group due to past experiences of prejudice events and rejection. Group Experiential Theme 1A2 was not a surprise. Frost et al. Noted that sexual minorities struggled to be accepted by society, experiencing stress resulted from experiences of prejudice, rejection, having to conceal, and had to develop coping mechanisms and gain access to social support. According to minority stress theory, Group Experiential Theme 1A2 can be understood by considering the effect rejection has upon the experience of anomie, feeling disconnected from society, or manifesting a sense of normlessness. According to Meyer, sexual minorities are rejected by society because their identity deviates from cultural norms, which exposes them to social control in the form of distal stress, such as societal stigma and prejudice events that engender proximal stress. Group Experiential Theme 1A3 contributes to minority stress research because it highlights how Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming persons concealed their identity to avoid structural stigma and minority stress. This finding confirmed the findings of Branstrom and Bachonkas 2021, who found that identity concealment was utilized as a strategy to avoid structural stigma. Group Experiential Theme 1A3 contributes to minority stress research by confirming Myers' 2003 finding that concealment caused minority stress and that sexual minorities had to conceal their identity, which constricted their agency by limiting their ability to express their true selves. Group Experiential Theme 1A3 was not a surprise. According to Pachonkas and Branstrom 2019, sexual minorities often must conceal their identity in hostile social contexts to avoid social stigma. For example, Pachonkas and Branstrom found that most sexual minorities in the world hide their sexual identity as a functional adaptation to stigma. According to minority stress theory, Group Experiential Subtheme 1A3 can be understood by considering how interacting in a hostile social context requires one to conceal their identity to avoid negative regard from society and oneself. Meyer found that concealment is a coping strategy used to avoid the negative effects of stigma, but it can be stressful to conceal and may result in adverse psychological health. Group Experiential Theme 1A4 contributes to minority stress research, and that it highlights how sexual minorities experience minority stress when they internalize negative social attitudes, a type of structural stigma. This finding confirmed the findings of Frost et al., who found that internalized homophobia is engendered in structurally stigmatic social contexts within which agents of socialization, including family, friends, and society, socialize negative social attitudes towards sexual minority groups, which is then internalized. The finding of Group Experiential Theme 1A4, internalizing homophobic attitudes, contributes to knowledge regarding the minority stress framework, and that Group Experiential Theme 1A4 confirmed the relevancy of internalized homophobia as a pillar of the minority stress model. Group experiential theme 1A4 reveals how internalizing negative social attitudes such as homophobia cause adverse psychological effects such as self-stigmatization, which devalues the self and causes psychological distress. Group experiential theme 1A4 was not a surprise. Michaels et al. Found that internalized homophobia is made worse when distal stressors cause the unconscious and conscious mind internalization of heterosexist attitudes. According to minority stress theory, group experiential theme 1A4 can be understood by considering the effect internalizing homophobic social values about non-heterosexuals has upon self-stigmatization. Coinciding with the theory of mind and the looking glass self, sexual minorities view themselves through the perceived eyes of others, and when they confront negative regard, they may devalue and negatively evaluate themselves, resulting in a negative self-regard. Implications and evaluations for research question 2. Research question 2 addressed participants' suggestions for how to reduce minority stress engendered by structural stigma and compounded by intersectional identities. Group experiential theme 2.1 contributes to minority stress and structural stigma research, and that reducing negative social attitudes towards sexual, racial, ethnic, and gender minorities was found to reduce minority stress, which confirmed the findings of Pachankis and Brandstrom and Pachankis, who found that changes in legislation, policies, and social attitudes reduce structural stigma and its adverse effects upon minorities. The finding that reducing negative social attitudes reduce minority stress also confirmed the findings of Hatzenbuehler et al. 2012 and Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018, who found that reducing structural stigma reduces societal level bias. The finding of group experiential theme 2.1, reducing negative social attitudes reduces minority stress, contributes to knowledge regarding minority stress theory. Specifically, group experiential theme 2.1 highlights how minority stress can be reduced by reducing structural stigma, which confirmed the findings of Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018 that disparities related to psychological health between heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals can be alleviated by deconstructing structural stigma. Group experiential theme 2.1 was not a surprise. Reducing structural stigma has positive effects. For example, Pachankis and Brandstrom 2019 and Brandstrom and Pachankis 2020 found that changes in legislation, policies, and social attitudes could reduce structural stigma and its effect upon minorities, and Hatzenbuehler et al. 2012 and Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018 found that reducing structural stigma reduces societal level bias. According to minority stress theory, group experiential theme 2.1 can be understood by considering the effect discriminatory social conditions have upon engendering minority stress and the resulting adverse health outcomes. According to Meyer, structurally stigmatic homophobic social contexts engender minority stress. The study by Hatzenbuehler et al. 2010 revealed that policy-level interventions that reduce structural discrimination can improve the mental health of sexual minorities. Implications and evaluations for RQ2A. Research question 2A addressed the ameliorative coping processes component of minority stress as it relates to structural stigma and their identification with sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and gender status. Group experiential theme 2A1 contributes to research on minority stress by revealing how ameliorative coping processes reduce minority stress, which confirmed the findings of Meyer 2015, who found that ameliorative coping processes that occur at both the individual and community level are part of the minority stress pathway for sexual and gender minorities. Group experiential theme 2A1 also highlights how sexual minorities turn to community to take care of oneself, which confirmed the finding of Meyer 2015 that belonging to a community reduced minority stress. The finding of group experiential theme 2A1, taking care of oneself, contributes to knowledge regarding the minority stress framework. Group experiential theme 2A1 accounts for how experiencing minority stress is associated with the development of individual and community level ameliorative coping processes, which confirm the findings of Meyer 2003 that experiencing minority stress is associated with developing stress ameliorating factors and that ameliorative coping processes are a relevant pillar of the minority stress model. Group experiential theme 2A1 was not a surprise. Meyer found that individual resilience is associated with coping and stigma and an increase in psychological well-being and personal agency. According to minority stress theory, group experiential theme 2A1 can be understood by considering Meyer's finding that sexual minorities develop individual level factors such as resilience, positive coping skills, and reappraisal to buffer adverse health effects engendered by minority stress. Meyer stated that individuals use a variety of coping skills, become resilient, and become hardy to cope with stigma and minority stress. Group experiential theme 2A2 contributes to research on minority stress, and then it highlights how social support counters the effect of stigma and reduces minority stress. Group experiential theme 2A2 accounts for how connecting with a community that shares a similar culture and experiences is uplifting and supportive, which confirmed the findings of Frost et al. 2022, who found that community connectedness reduces minority stress and increases social well-being for all age groups. The finding of group experiential theme 2A2, interacting with community, contributes to knowledge regarding the minority stress theory framework. Specifically, group experiential theme 2A2 highlights the relevancy of ameliorative coping processes on a community level as a pillar of minority stress, and that the effects interacting with the community in a non-stigmatizing environment and receiving social support were found to have a positive impact upon the psychological well-being of minorities. Group experiential theme 2A2 was not a surprise. Meyer found that group solidarity and cohesiveness reduced minority stress, enhanced well-being, and improved life satisfaction. According to minority stress theory, group experiential theme 2A2 can be understood by considering the role group-level stress ameliorating factors play in helping to cope with minority stress. Meyer stated that minority status is associated with resources, including membership in groups, that can protect against adverse mental health resulting from exposure to stigma and minority stress. Recommendations for practical application. Based upon the finding that reducing structural stigma reduces stress, it is recommended that practitioners should develop and implement strategies to reduce negative social attitudes towards sexual minorities. Another one, based upon the finding that stress experienced by sexual minorities often originates in the social context, it is recommended for practitioners to avoid attribution errors by recognizing that the origin of psychological distress experienced by sexual and gender minorities may be social in nature. Additionally, based upon the finding that ameliorative coping processes help sexual minorities cope with minority stress and become resilient to social stress, it is recommended that practitioners develop and master strategies that help sexual minorities cultivate ameliorative coping processes to increase resiliency. Recommendations for future research. This was the first qualitative research that examined Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people's experiences of minority stress and gender by structural stigma and compounded by intersectional social identities. Furthermore, this was the first qualitative research that examined the association between structural stigma and minority stress. Additional research into the subject for the Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming population and in general is needed. Therefore, a recommendation to future researchers is to qualitatively examine the effect structural stigma has upon minority stress and mental health for specific populations and in general. This research was limited by the need for generalizability to drift from the interview protocol and more specifically examine how each component of structural stigma, including laws, policies, and social attitudes, independently and interrelatedly cause minority stress. It would be beneficial to examine in depth how each component of structural stigma affects individuals more specifically and whether the effects of each component overlap or compound experiences of stigma and socioeconomic marginalization. A recommendation for future research is to ascertain which components and structural stigma and specific examples of each component of structural stigma affect sexual minorities the most to better focus interventions. This research did not ascertain the level of structural stigma in the environment participants existed in or the region they resided in. This is noteworthy because Pachanka's 2020-21 found that region was significant when examining the effect structural stigma has upon sexual minority psychological health. A recommendation for future research would be to control for region when examining the effect structural stigma has upon minority stress to ascertain which reasons are the most stigmatic and how the level of stigma in the environment affects minority stress. Intersectional identities create divergent experiences. A recommendation for future research would be to map out how divergent layers of intersectional identities and gender varying experiences of minority stress. Additionally, participants in this study described experiencing structural stigma across multiple arenas, including the education system, the healthcare system, the family, religious institutions, the workplace, and housing. A recommendation for future research would be to examine structural stigma within each institution to identify institutional structural stigma, and how it affects sexual minority health, along with personal narratives to support the identification of stigmatic institutions. Additionally, there is a mismatch in the literature regarding whether community connectedness buffers the effect of minority stress. Therefore, a recommendation for future research would be to qualitatively examine whether community connectedness truly buffers against minority stress. The interview protocol developed for this qualitative study yielded rich data regarding lived experiences of structural stigma, sexual minority stress, and intersectional factors that were associated with experiencing minority stress. Furthermore, this is the first interview protocol developed to examine the impact structural stigma has upon sexual minority stress with consideration for intersectional social identities. A recommendation for future research would be to duplicate this study or to apply it to different contexts to address the reliability of the interview protocol and transferability of the data. The personal story data gathered in this study was powerful, but this research was not designed to capture participant stories such as a case study, multiple case study, or narrative study could. A recommendation for future research would be to delve deeper into the lived experiences of structural stigma and minority stress that is compounded by intersectional identities with the purpose of telling a clarifying narrative. Conclusions. This study qualitatively examined Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming persons' lived experiences of minority stress engendered by structural stigma and compounded by intersectional identities. This study's research findings regarding the Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, nonconforming people's lived experiences of minority stress engendered by structural stigma and compounded by intersectional identities aligns with and supports the findings of prior research. The findings associated with RQ1 revealed that sexual minorities are negatively impacted by structural stigma, especially negative social attitudes, to the extent that it caused psychological distress, which supports the research of Hatzenbuehler. Furthermore, the psychological distress Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people experience was made worse due to being exposed to multiple forms of stigma, including heterosexism, racism, ethnocentrism, and cissexism, which supports the findings of Walobita et al. 22 that Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people are the most at risk for adverse health effects engendered by exposure to stigma. Identifying with multiple stigmatized identities made the experience of minority stress more complex and intense. Hispanic, Latinx, gay, lesbian, gender nonconforming people describe being disadvantaged for their sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and gender identities. The findings of RQ1A revealed that experiencing prejudice events and gender proximal stress in the form of expectations of rejection, concealing one's sexual orientation, and internalizing homophobic attitudes. This finding supports Meyer's minority stress model, and that all distal and proximal components of the minority stress model were found to be associated with exposure to structural stigma. The findings of RQ2 revealed that reducing structural stigma reduces sexual minority stress, which supports the findings of Hatzenbuehler et al. 2018, who found that reducing structural stigma reduces mental health disparities between heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals. And finally, the findings of RQ2 revealed that ameliorative coping processes in the form of taking care of oneself and interacting with a community of like-minded people assisted with developing resiliency when confronting structural stigma, which supports the findings of Meyer et al. 2015, who found that resiliency when confronting structural stigma supports mental health. Thank you so much. And references for days. Thank you.